Frank Whitman didn't hear the sentence at first. He heard the tone. That calm, practiced softness doctors use when they've already decided the conversation is over. Everything looks normal for your age. It landed gently. Too gently. Like a pillow pressed over something that was still breathing. Frank nodded, because that's what people do when authority speaks in a reassuring voice. He nodded even though the words didn't feel reassuring. They felt final. Like a door closing quietly behind him while everyone pretended it was still open. He sat on the paper-covered exam table, hands folded neatly in his lap, staring at a faded poster on the wall that explained blood pressure ranges, using cartoon hearts. The heart labeled excellent looked suspiciously young. The one labeled acceptable looked tired. The one labeled concerning looked like it had already given up. The doctor tapped a tablet, scrolling through charts and numbers Frank couldn't see. No surprises, she continued. Cholesterol is a little elevated, but nothing alarming. Joint stiffness, some muscle loss, expected at 72. We'll keep an eye on things. Expected. Frank had spent 40 years as a mechanical engineer.
He knew what expected meant.
It meant the system was designed around averages. It meant deviations were inconvenient. It meant individual stories were noise. So, the doctor said, smiling professionally, any other concerns? Frank opened his mouth, then closed it. He had concerns.
Plenty of them.
But none that fit neatly into a checkbox. Sometimes his knees felt stiff for a few minutes in the morning, and then strong all day. Sometimes his memory surprised him, sharp and precise, recalling details his daughter couldn't. Sometimes he felt a surge of energy late in the afternoon, when everyone said he should be tired. None of that belonged in the exam room. No, he said finally. I guess not. The doctor nodded, already halfway out of the conversation. That's good. Just keep doing what you're doing. And, remember, listen to your body. Frank almost laughed. 1.1. Averages don't have names. The parking lot outside the clinic was half full. Late morning. Retiree hours. Frank walked toward his car, the autumn air crisp enough to sting his lungs in a way that felt clean rather than threatening. He unlocked the trunk and loaded 2 grocery bags he'd picked up on the way in. One bag was heavier than it looked, canned goods, a large bag of rice, a watermelon he hadn't planned to buy, but did anyway because it reminded him of summers when food tasted better. He lifted both bags at once. No strain. No wobble. No warning from his back or shoulders. That's when the disconnect hit him. He stood there, holding 40 pounds of groceries, while his mind replayed the doctor's voice. Expected at your age. Frank lowered the bag slowly, as if they might accuse him of something. Well, he muttered to himself, somebody's wrong. He drove home through quiet suburban streets, past lawns trimmed with the kind of care that suggested people had time again. His neighborhood had changed over the years. Fewer kids. More flags. More walking groups moving at identical speeds. Frank parked in his driveway and sat in the car longer than necessary, hands resting on the steering wheel. He wasn't angry. That came later. Right now, he was unsettled. Because nothing felt wrong enough to explain the sentence he'd been given. 1.2. The Quiet Rebellion. Frank's house was modest, well-kept, and stubbornly unchanged. Same oak dining table. Same creak in the third stair. Same toolbox in the garage that still smelled faintly of oil and sawdust. He put the groceries away methodically, humming without realizing it. Something old. Something his wife used to sing when she cooked. That thought tightened his chest, but it didn't derail him. Grief had softened over the years, like a scar you stop noticing unless someone presses it. After lunch, Frank went out back to rake leaves. He didn't need to. The yard wasn't that bad. But the motion felt good, rhythmic and honest. He worked steadily for nearly an hour, stopping only when his phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his daughter, Linda. How was the appointment? Frank leaned on the rake, breathing evenly. He typed back. Fine. Normal for my age. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. That's good, Dad. Just take it easy, okay? Frank stared at the screen. Take it easy. He looked down at his hands, veined, spotted, undeniably old. But steady. Capable. He typed back nothing. Instead, he finished raking. 1.3. The Dinner Table Translation. Sunday dinner at Linda's house was a weekly ritual. Frank brought bread. Linda cooked too much. Mark, her husband, talked too loudly. The grandchildren drifted in and out of the room like weather. Frank sat at the head of the table by habit more than insistence. "So," Mark said, carving into the roast, "how'd the doc appointment go?" Linda shot him a look. "Mark." "It's fine," Frank said. "Everything's normal." Mark nodded, satisfied.
See?
"I told you. He's doing great for his age." For his age. Frank sipped his water. Linda leaned forward. "Did they change any medications?"
No.
"Recommend physical therapy?"
No.
"Any restrictions?" Frank paused.
No.
Linda frowned slightly, as if the lack of instructions made her uneasy. "Well," she said carefully, "we should probably start planning ahead anyway." Mark looked up. "Planning what?" "You know," Linda said. "Just being realistic." Frank set his glass down. "Realistic about what?" he asked. Linda hesitated. "About decline." The word sat there, heavy and uninvited. Mark cleared his throat. "She just means we don't want you overdoing it, Frank." Frank smiled thinly. "Overdoing what?" Mark gestured vaguely. "Yard work. Ladders. Stuff like that." "I raked leaves today," Frank said. Linda's eyes widened. "Dad." "I'm fine," Frank said calmly. Mark laughed. "You see? Stubborn as ever." The grandchildren burst into laughter, unaware of the tension threading the table. Frank smiled too, because that's what people do when they don't want to explain themselves. But inside, something shifted. They weren't talking with him. They were translating him. 1.4. The moment that doesn't make the chart. 2 days later, Frank climbed a ladder. Not to prove anything. Just to change a light bulb in the garage. Halfway up he felt it, not weakness, but awareness. A sudden clarity that sharpened his balance, slowed his breathing, anchored his feet. He adjusted his stance instinctively, without thinking. The ladder wobbled once, then steadied. Frank replaced the bulb, climbed down, and stood there for a long moment afterward, heart beating slowly, evenly. He knew, without drama, that something had just happened. Not strength, judgment, timing, the kind you don't measure. That night, lying in bed, Frank stared at the ceiling. His body had acted before fear could, before instruction, before expectation. And that scared him more than the wobble ever could have. 1.5. The question that won't sleep. At 3:17 a.m., Frank sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea he didn't remember making. The house was quiet in the way only old houses get, settled, patient listening. He thought about the doctor's words. Normal for your age. He thought about the ladder. He thought about Linda's face, tight with love and fear tangled together. And then the thought surfaced, uninvited but clear. What if decline isn't something that happens to you, but something you're taught to accept? Frank rubbed his hands together slowly. He wasn't angry at the doctor, or Linda, or Mark. They were all operating inside a system that made sense, most of the time. But Frank had spent a lifetime solving problems by listening to machines. And machines, he knew, always spoke if you paid attention. He looked down at his chest, his arms, his legs. "Well," he said softly to the empty room, "you've been trying to tell me something." Outside, the wind moved through the trees, unhurried. Frank sat there, awake, listening. Not to fear, not to charts, but to the quiet truth beneath both. And for the first time since the appointment, he didn't feel old. He felt alert. The ones who didn't leave when they were supposed to. Frank first noticed Raymond at the community center because Raymond wasn't behaving correctly. Correctly, in this case, meant slowly. Most of the men gathered near the back of the gym moved with a careful choreography. Pause, step, breathe, evaluate. They looked like they were crossing thin ice even when standing still. Raymond, on the other hand, was doing resistance band exercises with the mild irritation of someone stuck in traffic. Efficient. Impatient.
Alive.
He was 78. Frank knew this because Raymond announced it within 10 minutes of meeting him, as if daring someone to argue. 78, Raymond said, snapping the band back into place. They told me I'd be lucky to walk without a cane by 70. Frank raised an eyebrow. And? Raymond shrugged. Guess luck got bored. They sat on a bench afterward, both breathing a little harder than they wanted to admit. Raymond had been a trucker for 43 years. Drove through snowstorms, deserts, and nights so long they stopped feeling like nights. He'd quit after a minor heart scare at 68, minor being the word the doctor used after Raymond survived it. They gave me pamphlets, Raymond said, all full of words like avoid and reduce and accept. You notice that? Nobody tells you what to do, just what to stop. Frank smiled. Did you accept? Raymond snorted. I accepted that they didn't know me. That sentence lodged itself somewhere deep in Frank's chest. 2.2. Evelyn doesn't apologize for her pulse. Evelyn joined them the following week. She was 75, widowed, and walked into the center with the unapologetic posture of someone who had survived long enough to stop explaining herself. She wore red sneakers that didn't match anything else she had on. Frank noticed the sneakers immediately. So, she said, sitting down, which one of you is the troublemaker? Raymond grinned. Depends who's asking. Evelyn crossed her arms. My doctor told me last year I was doing remarkably well for my age. Frank winced in recognition. I asked him what would happen if I was doing well, period, she continued. He didn't laugh. Raymond burst out laughing instead. Evelyn didn't smile. I buried my husband. I raised 2 kids. I learned how to live alone without turning into furniture. And, you know what scares people the most? Frank shook his head. That I don't act grateful for being alive. Silence settled around them, not uncomfortable, just heavy. Frank felt something loosening inside him, a tension he hadn't realized he was holding. These people weren't defying age. They were ignoring permission. 2.3. What never makes it into the appointment notes. Over coffee after their workout, Frank listened more than he talked. Raymond spoke about the early retirement program that gently nudged him out of his job after the heart scare. Evelyn talked about friends who started shrinking, not physically but socially, canceling plans, apologizing for existing, preparing for disappearance years before it arrived. They don't mean to, Evelyn said, stirring her coffee. Fear does that. Fear tells you to get small. Frank thought about Linda. She loves me, he said quietly. Raymond nodded. Of course she does. But she talks like I'm already halfway gone. Evelyn leaned in. Because nobody teaches people how to watch someone age without grieving them prematurely. That hit harder than Frank expected. Later that afternoon, Frank sat alone in his living room, replaying the conversations. He thought about how medicine spoke in probabilities, how family spoke in caution, how everyone meant well, and how none of it accounted for the quiet intelligence inside his own body. No chart recorded instinct. No guideline measured readiness. Frank picked up a notebook he hadn't used in years and wrote a single line. What if I'm not declining? I'm diverging. 2.4. The experiment nobody sanctioned. Frank didn't call it an experiment at first. He just started paying attention. He noticed that his energy didn't follow a straight line. It came in waves. Short bursts of clarity followed by stretches of fatigue that passed quickly, if he didn't panic. He noticed that movement helped more than rest, as long as the movement was chosen, not forced. So he walked when he felt stiff. He sat when he felt sharp. He stopped obeying the clock and started obeying sensation. The changes were subtle, but unmistakable. He slept better. His balance improved. His mood steadied. Linda noticed too. You seem different, she said one afternoon when she stopped by unannounced. Frank smiled. Different how? More confident, she said. Then frowned. Are you pushing yourself? Frank considered lying. No, he said. I'm listening. Linda crossed her arms. Listening to what? My body. She sighed. Dad, that's not a plan. Frank met her gaze. It's the oldest plan there is. They didn't argue. But something hardened between them, a fear Linda couldn't name, and Frank refused to absorb. 2.5. The first real consequence. The symptom came on a Tuesday. Nothing dramatic. Just a tightness in Frank's chest while he was carrying laundry upstairs. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. Long enough to notice. Short enough to dismiss. He stood still. Breathed slowly. Let it pass. He did not call Linda. He did not call a doctor. He sat down and waited. The tightness faded completely, leaving behind a residue of awareness. Not fear, not confidence, but responsibility. That night, Frank wrote another line in his notebook. Listening doesn't mean ignoring danger. It means recognizing it early. The next morning, he scheduled an appointment. Not because he was scared, because he was paying attention. 2.6. The conversation that isn't official. The cardiologist was younger than Frank expected. Mid-30s. Efficient.
Kind.
Tired in the way people get when they still believe in systems that disappoint them. Everything looked stable, the doctor said after reviewing tests. Probably a brief spasm. Happens. Frank nodded. Should I be worried? The doctor hesitated. Just a flicker. But Frank caught it. Worried? The doctor repeated.
No.
Alert, yes. Frank leaned forward. What does that mean? The doctor glanced at the closed door. Off the record, he said quietly. After 70, bodies stop following rules cleanly. Some people decline quickly. Some don't. We don't have a great way to predict which is which. Frank waited. But guidelines, the doctor continued, are written for safety, not potential. Frank exhaled slowly. So what should I do? The doctor met his eyes. Respect symptoms. But don't assume every sensation is failure. Frank nodded. That was all he needed. 2.7. The argument that changes the terms. Linda found out about the appointment anyway. She always did. You scared me, she said, pacing Frank's living room. Why wouldn't you tell me? Because I didn't want fear deciding for me, Frank said evenly. Linda stopped pacing. I'm not trying to control you. I know, Frank said. But you're afraid. Silence. Yes, she said finally. I am. Frank softened. So am I. They sat down together. I don't want to disappear early just to make people comfortable, Frank said gently. And I don't want to pretend I'm invincible. Linda wiped her eyes. I don't know how to be in the middle. Frank took her hand. Neither do I. But we can learn. For the first time since his appointment, Frank felt seen, not as a risk, not as a responsibility, but as a person still negotiating his life. 2.8. The years no one prepares you for. At the community center the next week, Raymond slapped Frank on the back. You look like a man who survived a family meeting, he said. Frank smiled. Barely. Evelyn laced her red sneakers. Welcome to the unofficial years, she said. Frank raised an eyebrow. Unofficial. The years after people stop updating the manual, she replied. Where you make your own rules. Frank felt something steady inside him. Not defiance. Alignment. 2.9. The line that draws itself. That night, Frank stood on his porch, watching the sun sink behind the trees. He wasn't younger. He wasn't cured. He wasn't promised anything. But he understood something now that no doctor had said aloud. After 70, your body stops asking permission. It starts negotiating. And the outcome depends on whether you're willing to stay in the conversation. Frank went inside, closed the door, and wrote one final line for the day. The risk isn't living too hard. The risk is leaving early. 3.1. The warning that didn't knock. The warning didn't arrive like people expect warnings to arrive. It didn't knock loudly. It didn't collapse Frank to the floor. It didn't announce itself with sirens or urgency. It came disguised as a good day. Frank woke early, before sunrise, with a clarity that felt almost generous. His joints loosened quickly. His head felt light, precise. He made coffee without spilling a drop and stood at the window watching the neighborhood wake up in slow pieces. Garage doors rising, sprinklers clicking on, a dog pulling its owner down the sidewalk like it had somewhere important to be. He felt good. That should have been the clue. Frank had learned enough over the past weeks to know that good days after 70 weren't guarantees. They were opportunities. And opportunities, like warnings, needed to be handled carefully. He planned a simple morning: walk, light breakfast, maybe a visit to the hardware store. Nothing heroic. Nothing defiant. Halfway through his walk, the sensation arrived. Not pain. Not pressure. Disorientation. The sidewalk tilted, just slightly, like a photograph hung crooked on a wall. Frank stopped immediately. He didn't sit down. He didn't panic. He stood still and waited, counting his breaths the way he'd learned years ago during a particularly bad winter storm when panic had been more dangerous than ice. The world steadied. The moment passed. And with it came a realization colder than fear. This one mattered. Frank turned back toward home slowly, deliberately. Every step felt measured, not fragile, but negotiated. Inside the house, he sat at the kitchen table and waited another 10 minutes. The sensation didn't return, but it left behind a residue of certainty. This wasn't something to ignore. And it wasn't something to dramatize.
It was something to respect.
3.2. The call that changes the shape of time. Frank called Linda. She answered on the second ring, breathless.
Dad.
I need you to listen, Frank said calmly. That tone alone made her sit down. I had a moment, he continued. Not an emergency. But not nothing. Silence. I'm okay, he added. But I want you to come over. Linda was already grabbing her keys. When she arrived, she found Frank seated comfortably, tea in hand, television off. You scared me, she said, voice tight. I didn't want to, Frank replied. But I didn't want to pretend either. She knelt in front of him, eyes scanning his face. What happened? He explained exactly what he felt. No embellishment. No minimization. Linda listened carefully, her fear held in check by the precision of his words. We should go to the hospital, she said. Frank nodded. Yes. That surprised her. You're not arguing, she asked. Frank smiled faintly. Listening goes both ways. 3.3. The place where systems take over. Emergency rooms were designed for urgency, not nuance. Frank noticed it immediately. The moment he walked in, his story was compressed into categories: age, symptom, risk factor. His calm demeanor confused the triage nurse. You're not in pain? She asked.
No.
You're not dizzy now?
No.
She frowned. Then why are you here? Frank met her eyes. Because I know something changed. That earned him a longer look. He was admitted for observation. Linda sat beside his bed, scrolling anxiously on her phone. Mark arrived an hour later, jaw tight, already half inside worst-case scenarios. I knew this would happen, Mark muttered. Frank didn't respond. Tests followed.
Scans.
Blood work. Monitors humming quietly, like machines thinking out loud. A cardiologist reviewed the results and frowned, not dramatically, but thoughtfully. There's an irregularity, she said. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to warrant intervention. Frank waited. We recommend a minor procedure, she continued. Low risk. Preventative. Linda exhaled sharply. Mark nodded vigorously. Frank asked one question. What happens if I don't? The room shifted. The cardiologist hesitated. It increases the chance of a more serious event later. Increases, Frank repeated. Doesn't guarantee. No, she admitted. Nothing does. Frank leaned back against the pillow. For the first time since the appointment weeks ago, the decision wasn't theoretical.
It was now.
3.4. The argument no one wins. Linda spoke first. Dad, please. Mark added, this is exactly why doctors exist. Frank held up a hand. I'm not refusing, he said. I'm thinking. Linda's voice cracked. Thinking is what scares me. Frank looked at her gently. You think I don't understand the risk? She didn't answer. I do, Frank continued. But I also understand something else. What? Mark asked sharply. That my body told me about this before any machine did. Silence fell heavy and uncomfortable. I came here because I listened, Frank said. Not because I ignored it. Linda wiped her face. So, what are you saying? Frank took a breath. I want to do the procedure, he said slowly, but on my terms. The cardiologist raised an eyebrow. Which are? No rush, Frank said. No panic. And no treating me like I already failed. The doctor studied him carefully. I can work with that, she said finally. Linda sagged with relief. Mark looked unconvinced. Frank felt something settle inside him. Not triumph, not surrender, but alignment. 3.5. The night between decisions. Frank stayed overnight. Hospitals changed at night. The noise softened. The urgency receded. What remained was reflection. Linda dozed in the chair beside him, exhausted. Frank watched her sleep, struck by the quiet cruelty of aging, not the body's changes, but the way it forced children to imagine life without you before you were done living it. He didn't want to be brave. He wanted to be honest. He closed his eyes and listened inward, not for reassurance, not for courage, but for clarity. It came simply. You noticed early. You acted.
Trust that.
That was enough. 3.6. The procedure that isn't a battle. The procedure was uneventful. That was the highest compliment medicine could offer. Frank remained conscious, calm, asking questions out of genuine curiosity. The staff responded differently once they realized he wasn't afraid, just engaged. Afterward, the cardiologist stood at his bedside. You did the right thing, she said. Frank nodded. At the right time. She smiled slightly. Yes. That distinction mattered more than she realized. 3.7. The admission no one prints. Later that afternoon, while Linda stepped out to make phone calls, the cardiologist lingered. Can I say something unofficial? She asked. Frank looked at her. Those are my favorite things now. She hesitated. We don't talk enough about people like you. Which people? Frank asked. People who sense change before collapse, she said. Who don't ignore their bodies, but don't surrender to fear either. Frank absorbed that quietly. We should, she added. But systems move slowly. Frank smiled. Bodies don't. 3.8. The shift at the dinner table. Sunday dinner happened again. This time, the tone was different. Linda watched Frank closely, not anxiously, but attentively. Mark listened more than he spoke. The grandchildren noticed nothing at all, which felt like success. So, Mark said eventually, guess we were wrong. Frank raised an eyebrow. About what? About you being fragile, Mark admitted. Frank smiled kindly. You weren't wrong. Mark frowned. I wasn't. You were incomplete, Frank said. There's a difference. Linda reached for his hand. I'm trying to learn it. 3.9. The line that can't be erased. That night, Frank opened his notebook again. He wrote slowly, deliberately. The body doesn't betray you after 70. It negotiates honestly. Fear is what interrupts the conversation. He closed the notebook and felt something he hadn't felt since his wife was alive.
Continuity.
Not endlessness. Not youth. But presence that extended forward instead of shrinking backward. Frank slept deeply that night, not because danger had passed, but because trust had been restored the return without applause. Frank returned home on a Thursday. No balloons. No casseroles stacked on the porch. No dramatic sense of survival. Just quiet. The house smelled the same. The third stair still creaked. The afternoon light still angled through the living room window the way it always had, soft, forgiving, unbothered by medical events. Frank stood in the doorway longer than necessary, one hand on the frame, as if greeting an old friend who hadn't doubted him. He wasn't weaker. He wasn't stronger. But something fundamental had shifted. Before, he had been moving forward while being quietly pulled backward by expectation, by charts, by fear, by the way people spoke around aging instead of about it. Now the pull was gone. He unpacked his overnight bag, folded his clothes carefully, and made tea. His hands were steady, but that wasn't the victory. The victory was that he trusted them again. Linda stopped by later that evening. She didn't hover. That alone felt like progress. They sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from their mugs. I keep waiting for something bad to happen, she admitted. Frank nodded. That doesn't stop. No, she asked. No, he said gently. But it changes shape. For point two, what the body was protecting all along. Frank didn't rush back into anything.
He walked.
He rested. He worked in the garage in short, focused bursts. He declined invitations when his body said no, and accepted them when it didn't. The balance wasn't heroic. It was precise. What surprised him most wasn't what he could do, but what he no longer felt compelled to prove. The body, he realized, wasn't trying to preserve youth. It was protecting judgment, protecting dignity, protecting the ability to choose. At the community center, Raymond noticed first. "You move different," he said, watching Frank stretch. "Different how?" Frank asked. "Like you're not auditioning anymore," Raymond replied. Evelyn smiled from across the room. "That's because auditions end when you stop trying to impress the future." Frank laughed softly. Later, alone, the thought returned with clarity. The body isn't fighting age. It's guarding autonomy. And autonomy, he realized, was the real fear behind all the warnings. 4.3. The letter no one asked for. One quiet afternoon, Frank sat at his desk and wrote a letter. Not to Linda. Not to Mark. Not to a doctor or institution. He wrote it to no one specific, and to everyone who would never read it. He wrote about the moment people start lowering their voices around you. About how concern slowly replaces curiosity. About how be careful turns into don't bother. He wrote about how bodies speak in sensations, not symptoms, and how fear mistranslates them. He didn't offer advice. He offered testimony. I am not braver than you. I am not healthier than you. I am simply listening without interrupting. He folded the letter and placed it in the notebook. It didn't need an audience. It needed to exist. 4.4. The last test isn't dramatic. The final test came months later. It wasn't medical.
It was ordinary.
Linda invited Frank on a weekend trip. Nothing strenuous, just a cabin, a change of scenery. Mark hovered with concern disguised as logistics. Long drive, Mark said. Uneven steps, Linda added. Limited cell service, Mark finished. Frank listened. Then he checked inward. Not for courage.
For truth. I'll go, he said.
But I'll drive myself. Linda hesitated. Why? So, I can leave when I need to, Frank replied calmly. That answer changed everything. At the cabin, Frank walked when he felt steady. He rested when he didn't. He laughed without feeling reckless and declined hikes without feeling ashamed. Nothing went wrong. That, too, was the point. The truth doctors rarely say. On the last morning, Frank stood outside alone, watching fog lift off the trees. He felt his age fully, and he felt no urgency to escape it. The truth settled gently, not like a revelation, but like recognition. After 70, the body stops asking permission. It stops negotiating with averages. It stops obeying fear dressed up as caution. It tells the truth. Quietly.
Consistently.
Honestly. And the real question isn't how long you'll live. It's whether you'll listen long enough to live as yourself. Frank turned back toward the cabin, walking neither fast nor slow, just certain. Not defiant. Not resigned. Present. Final image. Weeks later, Frank walked his neighborhood at dusk. The same sidewalks. The same houses. But now, when people saw him, they didn't see fragility. They saw steadiness. And for the first time since someone told him he was normal for his age, Frank knew exactly who that sentence was meant to comfort, and who it never belonged to.